Mehran Kamrava from Georgetown University, Guillemette Crouzet from Warwick University, and Ejaz Haider, Senior Fellow CSSPR, University of Lahore.
Thank you. Since you've already introduced the panel, I don't have to do that. But let me begin with an apology to Professor Crouzet. I have not read her book. I have read Professor Kamrava's book. So I'm kind of blind when it comes to your work. And I'm, hopefully you'll explain that to me and to the audience as we go forward. But Professor Kamrava, if you permit, I just want to sort of lay down some of the methodology that you've used before you explain what the work is about. So the starting point, of course, is the fact that when the Arab Spring started in 2011, well, actually 17 December in Tunisia, when Bouaziz self-immolated himself, there was this sense across the world, in fact, well, actually, firstly, no one in the West really, and even in the Middle East, really knew that this would become such a movement. But it did become that movement. And there was a sense that, it was titled as the Arab Spring, that it would lead to more openness, democratic governments, and so on and so forth. But it proved to be, as you mentioned, quoting Cook, that it proved to be a false dawn. So Professor Kamrava's book is about what led to complete breakdown of order, of course, and then later as he calls it, the abyss of civil war and chaos. The essence of politics, state-society relations, but as he argues, they aren't mechanical. They are informed by cultural, ideological, and normative factors. And also the questions of citizenship and legitimacy are also crucial. And then he goes on to talk about two very important concepts. He actually employs a number of concepts, but offers definitions of two at the very outset: institutions and critical junctures, and the interactions of institutions, individuals, and processes. So, Professor Kamrava, let's start with that. You've used the concept of institutions as what the new institutional economists do, especially with reference to Ebner Greif and Douglas North. So give us a sense of what the methodology is, and then we'll take it forward.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here at ThinkFest. I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me and for providing this opportunity to be on the same panel with two distinguished intellectuals. So it's a pleasure being here. One of the things that I have been realizing over the last couple of decades is the importance of institutions. And I tried to capture that importance and the centrality of institutions in this book in three primary ways. First and foremost, I discovered that really beginning in the early 1950s, with the growth of the Nasserist state, institutions became quite important in shaping state-society relations and what the multiple consequences of the functions and operations of institutions were. And so that was one of the big takeaways for me. A second related takeaway was that by the time we come to the 2000s, that institutional function has not borne the desired results. and that in many ways, states have failed in their projects of social transformation. They have transformed societies, they have created middle classes, they have provided job opportunities, they have transformed the healthcare system, they have prolonged life, but they have failed to foster meaningful economic development in the same way that they wanted. A related takeaway from that was the fact that one institution throughout the Arab world played a very key and pivotal role when it came to this critical juncture that you mentioned of 2010, 2011, namely the military. And the armed forces proved to be the decisive institution that shaped the direction of the events that followed 2011. In fact, what we see is one of three pathways because of the way that the military functioned. First and foremost, if the military defected the civilian leadership and abandoned the civilian leadership the way it did in Tunisia first and then in Egypt, we have at least the temporary success of the revolution. Elsewhere, if the military didn't abandon the elites, or if the military itself fractured, as it did in either Libya or in Syria or Yemen, the result is civil war. And if the military stayed intact, if the military stayed with the political establishment and didn't abandon the civilian elites, in the case of Bahrain, for example, the revolution is aborted and Arab Spring doesn't happen. And that brought me to a third main takeaway related to institutions, is that once this process occurs, let's say the military abandons the civilian leadership, the elites play a decisive factor. And whether or not they agree on a set of new rules of the game, or if they decide to go solo and get rid of the others, if they play an exclusivist game, that again shapes the direction of events. So initially what we have in Tunisia is a bunch of elite consensus that then results in a temporary democratic experiment. In Egypt, the elites, the successor elites, don't necessarily agree on rules of the game. And so we have first the Muslim Brotherhood that comes with its unhappy experiment, and then you have the military that has now taken shape. So to me, elites are of course a social institution who then become a political institution, and they also play a key role.
Right, just a quick question before I take this to Professor Crouzet. So, institutions are a combination of cultural, traditional, historical evolution, if you will, and also a deliberate transformation towards modernity. Do you think that the effort by various non-monarchical regimes in the Arab states in trying to modernize, they shed many of those traditional institutions, and that could possibly be one of the reasons for why at that critical juncture things took a turn? And we'll come to the pathways and path dependence that you've talked about, and that perhaps if more traditional approaches could have served the state-society relations better?
That's a really good question. I think the conception that pre-2011 elites had of modernity was partial and in very ways flawed, because they perceived of modernity in either cultural or usually economic terms, but not in political terms. And so, you know, it's a much larger and richer question of what is modernity. And we can write volumes of books about that question. But at least in their conception, modernity meant privatizing religion and also fostering economic development, but not necessarily political relations. They didn't perceive of modernity, or they didn't apply conceptions of modernity to political practice and political norms. And so first of all, they failed in their modernizing projects to begin, because they couldn't deliver on their economic promises by the very fact that, for example, in Egypt, they had a very uneven relationship with religion, kept religion as some sort of a politically attractive alternative in the background as represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. But then, of course, their own incomplete or non-existent political conception of modernity is what did in people like Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali or Hosni Mubarak.
Right. I mean, it's a very interesting, shall I say, phase where shortly after Nasir, there's this entire thing in order to, Sadat did that in order to put down the Copts, actually co-opted the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. But Professor Crouzet, apologies again, so you'll have to explain, the basic content of your book and also your methodology.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you again to the organizer for making it happen. So in some ways, I think my book, tells the story probably, or a story twice before Professor Kamrava's book. So it's not even about the construction of these nation states in terms of pre-independence, post-independence, or during the mandate period, in some cases in the 20th century. My book is really about the 19th century. So a Middle East before nation states and a Middle East of empires, whether we talk about the Ottoman Empire, the Qajar, and of course the British Empire. So more specifically, the book is really about the Persian Gulf under British rule in the 19th century. I start at the onset of the Napoleonic Wars with the clash of 1798 and the French expedition in Egypt that challenges British authority, British imperial presence, not only in the Mediterranean, but also potentially in the Indian Ocean and in India, where the East India Company had established the company rule. And my book is about how gradually the British from India, from the perspective with actors of the East India Company, built an imperial structure around the Gulf. And my book connects this long story of a century of overspills of imperial rule from the subcontinent in the Persian Gulf to the invention of the term Middle East. Because the term Middle East really appears for the first time in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, in the writings of three people. You've got a man called Gordon, who was an East India Company soldier, who writes and says for the first time in the late 19th century that in India, some officials of the British government in India start to talk, using the term Middle East, about this zone which is guarding British India on its western flank. So technically, it's the territories under British rule, whether we talk about Egypt, the Gulf, Persia, so various regions or states or countries which have become linked to the British empires via forms of different treaties, different legal accords. And he says that it's this area that is being called for the first time the Middle East. And then the term appears in the writing of an American admiral, considered the father of geostrategy, Alfred Thayer Mehran, who also uses the term Middle East this time, again, to talk about the region around the Persian Gulf, which is key to the domination of the world, and especially of the seas of the world. And for Mehran, the Persian Gulf is basically the center of British naval power, naval power being the source of basically British power and really the core pillar of its imperial structure. And then it also appears in 1903 in the writings of a British journalist called Valentine Shirol, who had strong connections with George Nathaniel Curzon, the Viceroy of India at the time. And just like Gordon, he talks of the Middle East as this vast zone extending from India to Afghanistan, encompassing the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, but also Persia, parts of Baluchistan. And he says that it's the area guarding India on its western flank, and it's the area in the middle, it's the Middle East. It is between the Mediterranean and the Far East, but it's also the region enabling connection with India. Because there's the Suez Canal and there is also the Persian Gulf as like a parallel route. So that's the story basically my book tells, how this region is invented as an idea, how this region is invented because of British imperialism in the region and through various means. So my book is really a story before nation states, it's a story of empire. But to connect to what Professor Kamrava just said, I look at the different treaties the British signed with local powers, and especially the said-to-be Arab sheikhs of the Gulf. And so I can trace some of the legacy in terms of institutionalization of power, the creation of artificial dynasty to legitimize rule and to legitimize imperialism.
I was actually going to get to that because it's very interesting that, as you explained, that your book is like pre-nation state, pre-colonial era of the empires. So you heard what Professor Kamrava said. Do you think that the kind of power politics in terms of Machtpolitik and Realpolitik and the treaties that you talked about, Sykes-Picot Pact and mandates and the rest of it, do you think there's any possibility that those developments had any subsequent influence on how the post-colonial nation states as they came into being, the non-monarchical ones, and you also talked about the dynasties and all, that institutionalization in a way was impacted by those developments earlier?
I think so, definitely. When you look at the history of Iraq, the history of Jordan, there are institutions in the economic sector and the political sector, the instrumentalization then also of religious groups as well, especially for Iraq. All these dates back, to the Mandate period, but even earlier, when you think of an early British imperialism in Iraq, already using some Shia financial channels, for example. So there are some developments that we see in the 20th century in terms of conflicts or conflicts awakening that I think date back to even the pre-Mandate period. In some ways, the Mandate period was just a sort of affirmation of some tenets of a policy that had started much earlier on. At least that's my take on it. And for the monarchies of the Gulf, I think the example is even more striking in terms of, yes, creation of dynasties, the will also to really, the British had the very pragmatic policy locally. I don't think we can talk about a grand design in the 19th century. That's what I said yesterday. It's not about geostrategy. It's about imperial rule, and imperial rule is pragmatic. It's made of failures, of successes, of adaptation. But in the case of the different legal accords signed with the monarchies of the Gulf, there was a policy that was very gradual, that was very sort of progressing in time, and that was meant to really sort of gradually enforce the status of these local powers, which, have completely survived the Arab awakening. I think that's quite striking there. I don't know, why did it fail there, or why didn't it happen?
It's very interesting because, you mentioned Curzon. For instance, Curzon and also subsequent viceroys also, and London itself also, was very wary of Russian influence in the region. So one of the reasons Afghanistan and the Afghan wars that happened and creating Afghanistan as a buffer zone was part of that policy. Something similar to that also happened in the north of what is now India and Pakistan, and with Xinjiang, with Ladakh and all that. And of course, it's now, that's the legacy of the conflicts that we face now. But Professor Kamrava, two things. One, I would like you to comment on what Professor Crouzet said about the pre-nation state, this thing, and whether those developments had an impact on subsequent developments. And then if you could, as you mentioned, the sort of three phases of the state life: the political institutionalization, political consolidation, and then corrective action precipitated by crises or the desire to enhance political efficacy and staying power.
Yeah, thank you. I think Professor Crouzet points to a very critical point in the life of the Middle East. Without getting into too much detail, in political science, generally we talk about two kinds of institutions: social institutions or societal institutions, and then state institutions. And state institutions, imagine, are organizations that have some roots and values in culture. And social institutions are those that are usually revolve around identity. And what the British did by signing these agreements with local tribal leaders is that they took these social institutions and they facilitated their transformation into political institutions. So essentially they took tribal leaders and turned them into monarchs, essentially, and created monarchies in the Persian Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula. And so that British patronage continued until 1971. And when in 1968 Britain announced it was going to withdraw from the Persian Gulf, actually what later became United Arab Emirates went to Britain and said, don't leave because we need your security and protection, and we will pay the costs. And that security dependence continues up until just recently. And now is what we're seeing is kind of strategic shifts in the security orientation, not necessarily out of the American orbit, but we do see a greater level of autonomy. And so the legacy, the shadow of history that goes back to the late 18th century throughout the early 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, continues until today. Now, in terms of the second question that you asked, is that's exactly what we're seeing. We had this kind of the crafting of political institutions, institutionalization. Then we had, and that was in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring, where we have a host of new constitution writing practices across the Middle East, or at least in those places where Arab Spring has happened. Then we have this phase of political consolidation, and it occurred in Egypt somewhat earlier with Sisi coming with a hammer, and now Kais Saied is trying to do the same thing in Tunisia, but you might have known that over the last couple of days there have been major protests in Tunisia against him. And then comes at some point revolutionaries cannot live politically on promises alone. They have to deliver. And so that comes time for corrective action, where you have to make good on many of these promises that you've made to the population of a better life, better economy, integrity, which was the main demand of the people in the Arab Spring. Dignity was the main demand, karama. And so what we see is that right now we're in a situation where we have sense of resignation across the Arab world, in many parts of the Arab world, because people are just tired. They protested, they mobilized, they sacrificed, they had a revolution, and today they don't have much to look for. And that's where path dependence comes in.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. But Professor Crouzet, once again, the problem of not having read the book. So give us a sense of why you chose this particular period. I mean, in terms of its significance, or in terms of whether it actually informs in some way the developments that are happening now in the Arab world.
I think the reason why I wrote the book, it came really from also my training as a historian and as a historian of Britain. What I wanted to do in the book was to write, in some ways, another history of just the concept of the Middle East. So, go beyond, following also an historiography that looks at the Indian Ocean and at the Middle East as part of the Indian Ocean. It was to go beyond this idea of the Middle East as a region that was created in the aftermath of the First World War, even during the First World War, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and around the geography, which was centered around the mandates, so the French and the British mandates, and also the geopolitics of oil, and the newly discovered oil wells of Persia and of Iraq. And I wanted to show that before this idea of the Middle East as a mosaic of political territories awaiting independence under British and French tutelage, as a region really gush with oil, where also American interest started to be stronger in the aftermath of the First World War, there was before another idea of the Middle East. And what this region meant for the British Empire, what it meant culturally, what it meant also symbolically, what it meant politically, and that also it was a region that was not just governed from London or administered from London, but in the end is a product of the imperialism of the East India Company, and of the East India Company emerging as an independent political power in the subcontinent from the middle of the 18th century. So that's really the story I wanted to tell. But to jump on, again, what Professor Kamrava said, the idea of the politic of protection is indeed something which is essential to the idea of British imperialism in the Gulf. It's the foundation of the imperial structure, and the idea that in the legal agreements, Britain is considered as the protector of these dynasties and monarchies in the making, and that this protection, in some ways, is a political economy. And it will be a protection, so against, at the time, the Wahhabis, against the Egyptian, against the Ottomans, and etc. So the British sell the idea of protection. They sell the idea of peace, and they construct a narrative as being, the guardians of the Gulf, and it's a term that you find in the literature. What I've tried to do in my book is to challenge the idea of protection, and to say that we need to maybe develop another narrative that the protection was also made of violence, that it's a story of gunboats, it's a story of bombardment, it's the story of a political economy geared around the slave trade, that was really important for the pearl industry, but also the date palm industry. But this politic of protection is really the foundation of British imperial rule. And what I try to do in the book is show what the British got out of it, but also what these dynasties and monarchies in the making were getting out of it. And at a time where you had French pressure in Egypt, where you had Wahhabi pressure in the Arabian Peninsula, where you had Wahhabi raids, where you had the problem of a growing Kazimi power around the Strait of Hormuz, the British managed to sell this protection as being useful. But it's also a narrative. It doesn't mean that throughout the 19th century, the Gulf becomes just a peaceful backwater of the British Empire, with the supposed transformation of Gulf pirates into traders, etc., and etc. I challenge in the book this imperial narrative.
May I just add to that, if I may? This is a really key point that you're making, and I think one thing to just add to this is right now in 2022, 2023, we live in a sectarian moment in the Persian Gulf, where sectarian sensibilities have been heightened, particularly after the Arab Gulf. And it doesn't necessarily translate to all of the rest of the Middle East, but certainly the civil war in Syria, tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, all of these factors have magnified this sectarian moment. But it's important to remember that this is the second iteration of sectarianism, where when the British came to the Gulf, they forced local rulers to distinguish between themselves and those who were coming from the Iranian side. And so previously, local rulers in, for example, Bahrain, they would say, well, by virtue of being rulers, they were the protectors of their flock, whether that flock came from Najd inside the Arabian Peninsula or came from the Iranian side. And for purposes of bookkeeping, for purposes of statistics, the British said, no, those are the Iranians and you are the Bahrainis or the Arabs, the Ajams and the Arabs. And it was really with the growth of the British Empire when sectarian sensibilities and separate identities were awakened among the people. And so that the roots really in many ways go back to that. I don't want to place all the blame on the Brits, but I think it is important to remember that there is that important dimension that continues to today, and much of what we see today can be traced, the roots of it can be traced back to Britain coming into the region.
Let me ask a quick question before I return to Professor Crouzet and ask her the question that I wanted to. Could it be because not for any mala fide, but simply because what we saw the British do here also in the subcontinent, they would go to various districts and they would create these gazettes where they look at the ethnography, they look at various other identity differences, simply to record the things.
Exactly.
Could it possibly be because of that?
Absolutely. A lot of it was inadvertent and unintentional. The consequence was this kind of separation of identities. Whereas previously you were the subject to the ruler, now who are you the subject to the ruler that came from Najd, from inside the Arabian Peninsula, or came from the Iranian side? And so these distinctions and distinct identities begin to grow as an unintentional consequence of these record keeping.
Right.
Yeah. Can I just add something? Sure. So I think it's key that you mentioned the Gazette created in the subcontinent by the British in various districts, sort of like classifying, just naming different groups of what they identified as group. They did exactly the same in the Persian Gulf with the publication in the very early 20th century of the Gazetteer by John Gordon Lorimer, who was a member of the Indian Civil Service that was hired to do what they were doing in the subcontinent. So not only classify, name the geography, the botany, the different species, but also they treated human beings, they treated the population, the tribes, the different group that were there exactly the same way. So it's the famous, I guess, order and rule. So it's about creating an order to rule as a tool for administration.
Absolutely, data sets, creating data
exactly,
sets.
It's data.
But I wanted to ask you, since you talked about the dynasties, and Professor Kamrava also talked about, the tribes becoming then monarchies. Well, what exactly happened in terms of differences where you did not have the monarchies, where, for instance, in Egypt, you had a nationalist movement, the officers movement, Syria was different, and Iraq, where you had these left-wing ideologies, the Ba'ath and all that. Can you just tell us what those differences were and how they took different trajectories?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting in the history of the Middle East in the 19th century and early 20th century before independence, it's a mosaic of different types of political experiments in imperial rule. So in the Gulf, you see the exportation or the translation in the Gulf of the system of indirect rule that was created in India around the role of the resident, and which is a product of the East India Company. They exported it there. In Egypt, it's different. It's a regime of protectorate. And then you've got the mandate system, where Britain acted just as a supposed tutor, and they're about creating national government. So I think this is what I show in the book, at least in the case of the Gulf, is the pragmatism into taking advantage of local situation. It doesn't mean that it's immediately a success, and of course it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with a lot of violence and the cost that we've just talked about in terms of, yes, classification, reification, creations of groups, and creation of parts of societies that then enter into conflicts and clashes.
So coming to past dependence, Professor Kamrava. So at one point we talk about the causal variables, rational and intentional choices in the institutionalization phase, path dependence in the consolidation phase, and then a mix of rational choices and path dependency to remedy emerging institutional deadlocks. Now, you have put a lot of emphasis on this, also through, in a way, an indirect literature review where you talk, James Mehran and, Levy and Greener and various others, Kathleen Thelen and others. But I get a sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there is this sense of a bit of the deterministic in this, in terms of having at that critical juncture, taking certain decisions, and then those institutions to grow and create their own structures in a way that the cost of getting out or exiting becomes greater than the cost of actually staying in, or lock in as one of the,
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for pointing that out. The question that I mulled over was, how do institutions change, and why, and what are the processes and the causes? And I finally came to the conclusion that there are critical junctures, let's say revolutions, or when you're writing a constitution, where elites get together, they have a lot of leeway. In many ways, they have a blank slate, and they kind of lay out, outline their ideals. Doesn't mean those ideals are democratic, but they have greater maneuverability and ability to think outside the box, and so they lay out. If there's a commitment to, for example, have some sort of consensus or agree to disagree, then we might end up in some sort of a democratic political system. But whatever system they create, whatever decision they make, it becomes a lot harder to get out of that decision later on than it is the next day or in the immediate aftermath. And so that's what I mean by path dependence, because certain institutions develop a rhythm of their own. You create a parliament, people then decide what the parliamentary procedures ought to be, members of the parliament. They develop their own traditions, their own ways of doing things that then become difficult to deviate from later on as it develops a life of its own.
Right, so if I may be critical, on this as well, not exactly a minor point, but nonetheless, is it even possible, when you talk about a clean slate, is it even possible to begin with a clean slate? I mean, there are historical processes, cultural sort of, impediments, if you will, and a number of other things. So even when you sit down to actually chalk out, for instance, a new constitution, can you have a complete breakaway, thinking that this is the tabula rasa, whereas none exists?
Excellent point. And surely we all have our idiosyncrasies, we all have our cultural backgrounds, our own assumptions, our own baggage that we come with. And of course, that becomes a guide to our current action or our ideals. Nevertheless, Take, for example, Khomeini, and he came up with this idea of Islamic government. Now, yes, surely he didn't come up with this out of nowhere, but it was radically different compared to what existed. And so while there are certain continuities, there are also certain ruptures and certain fundamental breaks. And there's the clash and conflict between these ruptures and continuities that ultimately result in some sort of a synthesis.
Right. So I'm going to open the floor for questions because we're left with about 20 minutes. But before I do that, actually the final sentence of your book, and it kind of, it's like the wheel coming full circle. Power and politics in the Arab world are likely to remain the contested terrains that they have been. And hopefully we'll have the last 5 minutes to actually talk about some of the points that you have written in your conclusion. But for now, let's open the floor for questions, and you can identify yourself and ask a question.
My name is Hussain Nawaz Adil, and my question is, you have talked about how military and political establishment collide and what their results are if they collide and if they do not collide. But what are the impacts of different groups like ISIS and other terrorist groups that inflated during these revolutions that are going on in the Middle East? So what are their impacts and how they change the system or the sequence of the events that goes on in the Middle East?
Thank you. Should we answer?
I think we can take a couple of more questions, and is there another right there?
So on the topic of the Arab state, we noticed that Arab states are essentially divided into two regions, the North Africa and Middle East, who, while sharing a certain culture, are essentially two different peoples. One's an Arab Berber people and one are the Arabian Peninsula. How far do you think that their political development is influenced by this fundamental difference? Because just like Iran and Arabia are two different, albeit similar nations, that influences how their politics and history is shaped. And a small minor question is, we mentioned how the British fostered these monarchies in the Arabian Peninsula and tried to protect them. Why did that fail in Yemen?
My name is Hamad and I'm a law student at LUMS. Professor Crouzet, you mentioned about the imperialist aspect of the creation of these Arab states. Do you think that Anglicist or imperialist mindset is still leading to how these states are now trying to modernize? For example, take Saudia's, KSA's example, how they are trying to modernize their state continuously.
Okay, so I'll come to you. Let's answer these questions. There's one for you, there's a second question which I would want you to answer also, and there's the third question for you. Professor Kamrava.
Thank you. When the Arab Spring happened, one consequence was that in cases where you had a fracture of central authority, in places like Syria, for example, or Yemen or Libya, you had these civil wars where the state became unable to exert its authority across the territory, in all of the territory. And that in turn created opportunities for centrifugal forces to make their presence felt. It created an opportunity for groups like ISIS to emerge. And one of the problems was that, civil wars have their own crescendo and then they decline. But in the process of Arab Spring, what we see, these civil wars became prolonged artificially because you had other actors, other regional actors become involved. Saudi Arabia, Qatar became involved on the part of the so-called revolutionaries. Iran became involved on the part of the state in Syria. And so these civil wars became prolonged, and the longer they became, the greater the opportunity was for groups like ISIS or other non-state actors to become active. And so we have this unfortunate mixture of lack of central authority, intense regional competition, and then the rediscovery of the region by some of the larger global powers, the United States, Russia, and then, of course, Turkey, that all became involved. And as a result, we have the tragedy that is the Syrian civil war. You talked about the Arab world being divided between North Africa and the Middle East. I'd actually add a third division, and that's the Arabian Peninsula. So you have North Africa, you have the Levant, Greater Syria and Lebanon, and then you have the Arabian Peninsula. In the book, I have a separate chapter for the Arabian Peninsula because many of the developments and dynamics that are found commonly in North Africa and in the Levant are not found in the Arabian Peninsula, where you basically have oil monarchies, or to be rude, you have petrol stations with flags. And so these petrol stations with flags now have become empires on their own, United Arab Emirates and so on and so forth. So yes, there are, I think there's for those of us who study, and we started the discussion with a question on methodology, which I cleverly dodged. But part of the methodology that we have to grapple with is how much generalization do you resort to versus attention to specific details that set these cases apart from one another.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a great question. And in the book, I tried to go beyond what you just described. So differences in populations or settlements. I don't deny that they existed, but as we discussed, they were instrumentalized by the British. Identities were created when the Middle East, and especially all the space around the Persian Gulf, was really organized by connections, and that's what a whole historiography about the Indian Ocean has demonstrated. You had all these economic and social networks that crisscrossed the Arabian Peninsula and connected it with Persia, but also the whole of the Indian Ocean. So the Middle East and also North Africa are maritime worlds, not only looking over the Mediterranean, but towards the Indian Ocean. So why no politics of protection in Yemen? The history of Yemen under British rule is very simple. The British were interested in Aden, which they took in 1839, sending troops of the East India Company from Bombay and from other East India Company outposts. Once they take Aden, once they have secured basically a coal station that then becomes a station for steamers and etc., they are happy. So they didn't get involved in the local tribal politics of the interior. In the interwar period, and even after the Second World War, when Aden is really important because it's on the air route still for India, and then after the independence of India and Pakistan, it basically becomes about maintaining some independence in the Arabian Peninsula, but also close to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, etc., and etc. It becomes about influence in the Middle East. There they get involved in local politics. They implement huge development or what they call development policies around growing cotton, just like they've done in Egypt. And there they meet with a very, very strong opposition of local tribes who, guess what, are very, very sensible to the discourse of Gamal Abdel Nasser. But there was never from the start the same politics of protection, because the only thing that they really cared about was this outpost of Aden that paved the way basically to India.
And then there was the third question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm really sorry. Could you repeat it? Because I didn't get it.
The modernization of, for example, Saudis.
Yeah.
Based on the perceived Western standards. So do you think that is leading because of the Anglicist or Orientalist maybe, or the imperialist mindset, which led to the creation of these states?
Definitely, I think yes.
Well, my name is Ejaz and I'm from Government College. My question is regarding the current scenario in Saudi Arabia. We are witnessing a big change in Saudi Arabia, whether it's in socio-economical or political change. What do you think would there be a slight change in their political system also, as we are witnessing in UK? They don't have the rigid, kingdom system. They have the slight different kingdom
Right,
system.
we got that question.
So is there a possibility in Saudi Arabia as well?
Okay, right. So this was the last. You want to divide these questions?
You go ahead. You have much more paper than me.
Thank you. The question about the fragility or strength of the states of the Persian Gulf is one that comes up again and again. And I think we need to take into account three important factors that underlie the continued stability and strength of the states of the Persian Gulf. First and foremost, in many ways, these tribal dynasties have been based on a social fabric that has become political. So these Saudi Arabia, the country is named after the family. In Qatar, the Al Thanis. In Bahrain, the Al Khalifa, the Al Sabah in Kuwait. These are not just isolated families. They're part of the social, political fabric of society. And so there's this thesis of the natural state, whereby a social group captures or becomes the state, and so the state-society divide that we see in other parts of the Middle East doesn't exist. That's one. Second, we cannot ignore the political economy of oil and the fact that, for example, in Qatar, the average Qatari person is worth around $534,000 US dollars. And he or she is aware of their privileged status, and they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. This is the rentier state theory. And lastly, let's not forget that these are small, extremely easily governable populations. Qatar has less than 300,000 people. Kuwait has about 500,000 to 600,000. Bahrain. UAE has a couple of million. That's a district in Lahore. So imagine how easy it is for the state to govern these countries. They're not going to fall. The tribal system. So I think that answers this question of tribalism. And then you asked about the current changes in Saudi Arabia, if I may talk about that. You know, Saudi Arabia today reminds me of Iraq in the 1980s. I am old enough to remember Iraq of the 1980s, which was oftentimes contrasted with the archaic rulers of Iran at the time, the Ayatollahs that were implementing an austere Islamic political system. And in Iraq, you had this exciting, modernizing ruler that was secular, and his name was Saddam Hussein. And what's happening in Saudi Arabia today is not very different. Exciting social changes and political red lines, and then whatever he's doing invading a country, Yemen, taking the prime minister of Lebanon hostage, dismembering and then dissolving in acid critics. This is not an indication of modernity. This, to me, is very clever politics, buying off the population with rock concerts and then ensuring that political red lines are not traversed. I don't see any indication of democracy or meaningful political changes anytime in the near future.
So just before we close, so here's the, if I may, 6 or 7 points in your conclusion. So contention and contestation will continue, and there are few signs that will change in terms of power arrangements and state-society relations. Authoritarian regimes are often adaptable and durable, and they do this through co-option, partial opening, rigged elections, and other safety valves. Add to that coercive and ideological apparatuses. Then there is also the nature of social movements. They can follow several different paths, and that depends, those paths that are taken depends on how the state responds to the movement. Cohesion of the state elite that Professor Kamrava talked about is also important. If the elite compact breaks down, the grip on power becomes questionable. If it doesn't, they can hang on to power indefinitely, or if not indefinitely, at least for a long term. State capacity, i.e. political leaders, whether they can retain a level of autonomy from the social actors and also carry out developmental agendas and enhance legitimacy. And then there's the importance of perceptions. Civil war experience means less probability of violence because, you have this memory of what happened. I mean, in theory, what Professor Kamrava is saying that in the event that today Syria actually stabilizes and subsequently there are protests or demonstrations about something, it is unlikely or very unlikely to fall back on the kind of violence that it has experienced. And another very important point that Professor Kamrava makes, and he kind of flagged it briefly, the spread of sectarian identities as part of the larger identity of the society to which the individual belongs. And in this case, much of this has actually been given a fillip, deliberate policy by the state actors in order to, for their own longevity. But it has consequences, broader consequences for the region. And attention to institutions, actors, and processes. So, in a nutshell, it's unfortunate, but empirically, perhaps much closer to the truth, that, as I said, the last line from Professor Kamrava's book, that what we are witnessing, unfortunately, is likely to continue in the near future, both for endogenous reasons as well as exogenous reasons. But thank you all for being here. Let's give a big hand to Professors Kamrava and Crouzet. And we also close the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, ma'am.